You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. On the 7th of September 1812, the invading forces of Napoleon Bonaparte fought Russia's armies at the obscure village of Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. The biggest battle of the campaign was to prove fateful for Napoleon's military schemes. A few months later, the remains of the bedraggled Grande Armée began their long, disorderly retreat, harried by Cossacks and the bitter Russian winter. But what caused Napoleon to invade in the first place? And why did the campaign of 1812 prove such a disaster? To discuss these issues, Voice of Russia's Joseph Richardson is joined by Professor Michael Browers, tutor in modern European history at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and Hugh Strawn, Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford.
Why does Napoleon feel that he has to amass this vast army in order to invade Russia? Professor Hugh Strawn.
Well, the issue for Napoleon in the political sense, rather more perhaps in the economic sense, is what he would describe as the continental system, the desire to control the economy within Europe, the landmass of Europe, and hope that by doing so he could debilitate Britain, which was dependent really on wider patterns of trade. Russia was breaking that blockade, was breaking the economic stranglehold which Napoleon hoped to put around Britain. There are many other motives, but in terms of the sort of wider geopolitical context of the Napoleonic Wars and the long-term clash between France and Britain, that's the context within which this campaign is set. I mean, in addition to that, of course, you have to think about Napoleon's own desire for continuous conquest. Here is a man who really feeds on war and whose right to remain in power depends on war, and there is no logical limit. Once he stops, what's he going to do? Is he really going to establish the sort of solid Napoleonic empire which his apologists want to imagine he was going to create? And the answer is I don't think he ever was going to do that.
Dr. Browers, do you agree with this? Is Napoleon essentially fixated on war to the extent that he can't conceive of pursuing any other option in his dealings with Russia?
Well, I agree very much with Professor Strawn about the, as it were, the political and economic motivation for the war. I've never really been convinced by the argument that Napoleon is insatiably driven by conquest. I mean, this is planned as a very rapid campaign, very rapid, a matter of weeks, to go in and teach Alexander a lesson, to bring him back into the blockade. If you read through a lot of the military correspondence, he's very concerned about having to fight on two fronts, about having to pull good troops out of Spain, where in 1811 he's winning. He knows he's gambling in that respect. He has an option. He is being urged, particularly by his supporters in the Duchy of Warsaw, the Poles, to start annexing parts of Belarusia, to start annexing parts of Lithuania. As far as I know, there are no plans to do that at all. This is a rapid campaign to teach Alexander a lesson. They'd made a deal in 1807 at Tilsit about spheres of influence, and I think Napoleon wants to return to that. I really don't think, in this respect, he's driven by conquest. I do think he wants to put his, shall we say, precarious allies, the Austrians and the Prussians, to the test. I do think that's an element.
Right. Okay. So basically, his initial intention is just to have a very short campaign and to get out of there quickly. But it doesn't go according to plan. Why doesn't it go according to plan, Professor Strawn?
The essential challenge is, can he fight war close to the frontiers? Is he going to win the war short of Smolensk? Is the sort of dividing point, as indeed it would be arguably for the German army in 1941. One of the reasons we're sitting here discussing this is because actually Napoleon doesn't get his big battle early enough in the campaign. If you think of Napoleonic warfare as designed to maneuver with speed in order to bring the enemy to battle and to use the battle in order to achieve your objectives. In other words, battle is absolutely central to how you're constructing your strategy. Then if you don't get that battle, you're in trouble. And, the obvious point, which we now are very clear about in retrospect, but isn't at all obvious at the time, is that because Russia has the space to be able to trade, it can avoid battle in a way that the other opponents that Napoleon's had to fight so far have not. It's not obviously without controversy. I mean, because what you're doing is giving up territory, giving up your own resources as you retreat, and that isn't an easy thing to do. Just because there are clearly those within Russia who argue you should be holding territory, you should be holding your resources, you should be defending major cities and fortifications. But absolutely, it becomes a conscious plan, and it turns Russia's geographical range and strength into an enormous asset.
So, why doesn't Napoleon adapt to this campaign? Why does he continue to pursue the same plan of trying to gain a decisive victory in a set-piece battle, even when it's clear that the Russians aren't prepared to give battle?
Dr. They do eventually, of course, give battle at Borodino, but he has no other option once he's embarked on this campaign. And this, I would accept what Michael says in terms of the pursuit of conquest, perhaps not being as important as I was stressing it was, and I would also agree probably by this stage of his reign, here is somebody who, and we see it elsewhere in his behavior and his diplomacy, who is thinking of ways of making his regime more stable. But he still is very dependent on military success for his own reputation. I mean, having got there through the battlefield, if he loses on the battlefield, then the credibility of his own authority and the credibility of the French army, even if this army isn't overwhelming the French, as it's made up, but the credibility of this army will be undermined. And he, Clausewitz, the military theorist who served in this campaign, makes the point that Napoleon did nothing illogical, given his own way of fighting. He said, he had no other option because he depended on the pursuit of battle in order to make his own system of war work. And so he goes on pursuing that. And of course what he does as he advances is that he exhausts his own army simply because he can't supply it properly, simply because of enough happens in terms of contact with the enemy for continuous losses to suffer, and his own lines of communications are being lengthened. But the longer those lines of communication become, the more desperate it becomes for him to get the decisive battle, to get the payoff for all this effort.
You're listening to Voice of Russia radio station. I'm Joseph Richardson, and I'm joined by Hugh Strawn, Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford, and Michael Broers, Professor of Modern European History at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford.
There are two other things that I think we need to remember as well. As Professor Strawn said quite rightly, he's not doing anything illogical. He's not doing anything wrong. He has a major engagement at Smolensk, which technically he wins, and he does a lot of damage to the Russian army. The same happens at Borodino. I mean, technically he wins Borodino. The Russians cede the field. I mean, their losses are very, very large, and this is sequential. It's marvelous with hindsight to sit back and say he shouldn't have been drawn in, but looking at it another way, I've caught them, I've hurt them. I've caught them, I've hurt them. I'll catch them again. The other wider perspective is this. In 1809, he's pretty much definitively destroyed the Austrian army. I mean, Austria has ceased to be a serious military threat to anybody. And that's partly one of Napoleon's weaknesses, actually, because he insists on using this weakened Austrian army to protect his southern flank. The same with the Prussians in 1806-07. They are crushed at Jena-Auerstadt. They have military restrictions imposed on them, which actually they managed to circumvent with Alexander's help in the intervening years between 1807 and 1812. But even so, technically, they are a weakened army. if he can catch and destroy the core of the Russian army, at one big battle in the pursuit of this campaign, he has knocked out the last effective check to him in Europe.
And he would essentially become supreme across the continent.
Well, it would be very hard, put it this way. Where would Britain now find a continental ally to do its fighting for it in the east? Where? If he destroys Alexander's army, which is much improved from the army he last dealt with in 1807 in the Eylau-Friedland campaign, if he can deal it a killer blow, it will be years before anyone can rebuild to seriously challenge him in the east. I think that's a very important wider point to make.
Absolutely, and I would add to that there's it's the failure. In the end, Napoleon is only going to be defeated by an effective coalition of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and there is no pivot for that coalition once Russia's dealt with. There's nobody else around whom an effective coalition will be built, and of course, if he does succeed in Russia, then his capacity to pick up the point Michael Broads has already made, but the implication of what he was saying about Spain is that Napoleon will be able to reconcentrate in Spain. So, the British foothold on the continent, which is after all essentially in a peripheral campaign or a peripheral part of Europe, will be put under considerable pressure.
So Russia isn't this diversion. Napoleon actually considers it key to eventually triumphing, to kind of asserting his authority and vanquishing Britain.
It must be said only really because, to go back to what Professor Strawn was saying at the beginning, only because Russia is breaking the continental blockade. In 1807, Alexander I, the Tsar of Russia, and Napoleon strike a deal of spheres of influence. You leave me alone, I leave you alone. Now, there are tensions there. There are tensions because Napoleon resurrects a rump Polish state in the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which the Russian Poles look to, which Alexander's nervous about. There are tensions, but they're not overridden by anything until very powerful commercial interests within Russia start to work on Alexander. And those commercial interests, unlike in most Western Europe, are the big Russian court nobility. They have important trading links with Britain for raw materials and for agricultural produce. That the continental blockade, not so much the system. The system's about creating an internal market, which Russia is not part of. It's more the blockade. Russia's breaking the blockade. Alexander's under pressure to do this. He's very nervous about his court nobility. You've got to remember some office history here. Not one Russian Tsar, male ruler, has died peacefully in his bed for 100 years. They've been basically done in by their court nobilities. Alexander knows that. So he starts to give way, often against his better judgment.
So he's caught in a bind.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is. But so is Napoleon. Because if you go right back 10 years, there was a voluntary blockade against the British in Europe, where the Northern League of Russia and the Scandinavian countries, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, were all fed up with the British. And there's a voluntary blockade that almost brings Britain to its knees, and certainly brings Britain to the conference table in 1802 to negotiate. Now, Napoleon's hoping that's going to happen again.
But it doesn't.
But it doesn't.
Contrary to expectation.
That's right.
And, I mean, do you think Alexander anticipated that Napoleon might invade? I mean, was he caught? Was the Russian army essentially caught unawares, or were they very much aware that Napoleon was planning such an invasion to bring them to heel? Hugh Strawn.
The logic of Napoleon's actions is impeccable in terms of the argument that Michael's just been developing, and so to that extent, it's hardly a surprise. And the subordination, I think you need to go back again to the position of Prussia and Austria, the subordination of those two states to French rule, and their weakness and the frustrations, of course, which many in inverted commas, German nationalists, of which there are beginning to be some, the frustrations which they feel mean that, but because of that subordination, means that actually the Tsar knows perfectly well that he is under threat. That he is, if he's going to behave in this, if Russia is going to behave in this way in breaking the blockade, then actually there is the provocation there. Napoleon will act.
And I mean, in this campaign, I mean, Napoleon did make a lot of preparation, so he didn't go into this unprepared, but he finds himself essentially, as the campaign goes on and on, without sufficient resources to wage it. I mean, what happened there?
Well, you're talking about phenomenally long lines of communication, and you're also talking about a country that is agriculturally less advanced than the sort of areas where Napoleon had been campaigning hitherto. I mean, it's not quite true, of course. The further east that he's got in Europe during the course of the Napoleonic Wars, the more he's been exposed to this problem. But the sort of classic campaigning areas of the 18th century, the Low Countries, northern Italy, were fertile lands, many of them the subjects of agricultural improvement, and better able to support an army, at least for a short period of time. So Napoleon's got, I mean, a problem that is to do with the state of development of Russia. It's compounded because, of course, the very size of his army is much, much greater than anything people would have tried to put into the field before. I mean, in the 18th century, you're dealing with an army size in a battle of, these are random rather than specific figures, but the order of 30, 50, maximum 70,000 men. And Napoleon's is assembling an army which is much, much bigger than that, and therefore has to be fed, and fed over a longer distance and a greater period of time, because as you know, it isn't a short campaign in the end. And that is, of course, why the advance on Moscow seems to be so important, because it does seem to be some way of getting out of the logistic nightmare into which he's being sucked.
Of dealing a knockout blow, essentially.
Yeah, well, the knockout, and this is the trade-off in most wars of maneuver. Can you effect a knockout blow before your economic capacity to sustain the war is undermined?
And by Dr. Broers, by the time of Borodino, is it essentially the case that his campaign is foredoomed to failure? He's just lost too many men through lack of supplies, disease, and attrition, essentially.
Not in terms of bringing the Russians to battle and dealing the knockout blow, because Borodino is a very near-run thing, even more so than Waterloo. The Russians have taken a mauling. It's not necessarily the case that it's doomed from the point of view of dealing a blow to the Russians. But one thing you can say, I think quite safely, and it'd be interesting to hear Hugh on this too, is that he now does have to retreat. That's always been the plan. He's got to fall back. He's got nothing to fall back on. What stores he has have been plundered by Cossacks, by Russian partisans, and also, in a sense, by his own men. I mean, he's created a wasteland behind him because he's had to provision his army on the way back. And this is such a serious problem that it actually even affects the Russian pursuit of Napoleon. Part of the reason he gets away, or gets as far as he does before he's almost caught at Berezina, is that the Russian armies themselves have to steer clear of Napoleon moving through the central corridor, not because they're afraid of him, but because they can't supply their troops either by going in there. They have to keep their distance.
You're listening to Voice of Russia radio station. I'm Joseph Richardson, and I'm joined by Hugh Strawn, Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford, and Michael Broers, Professor of Modern European History at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford.
This is really the point where the campaign actually falls apart. It's on the retreat rather than on the advance, because that's when the French army collapses. It's when his allies, particularly of course the Prussians, change sides, and it is when you're putting, and obviously it's later in the year, and therefore things aren't growing. There isn't the grass on the ground for the horses, and so on and so forth. It's not the advance that miscarries as much as the fact that there is no option for an effective retreat. And as Michael says, I mean, the fact that the Russian army has to go by an entirely different route, which of course at one level is also Napoleon's salvation, because actually they can't press the retreat as tightly as they might have wanted, or as military logic says you should. It is largely up to partisans and guerrillas to harry and inflict losses on the French as they go.
Well, this is quite an interesting aspect of the campaign. I mean, he's facing large-scale guerrilla warfare and quite savage attacks on his retreating forces. I mean, to what extent is this a unique form of warfare that he's experiencing?
Well, he's run into this kind of thing in Spain. In fact, he's run into guerrilla warfare almost everywhere he's gone in Europe. He's faced with massive peasant risings in Italy and inherent banditry in southern Italy, and I mean even in many mountainous parts of the north for a very long time. But he's never faced it in these kind of conditions. And I think there's an interesting point to make here, that we're not actually, in the case of the retreat, as far as what I've been able to read about it and study about it, shows that he's not necessarily just dealing with bands of disorganized peasant rebels. Russian partisans tend to be Russian military units, rather like the Spanish partidas, who've been cut off in the retreat and who therefore help organize peasant resistance. They do most of the fighting, the peasants support them, and particularly the mobility of the Cossack cavalry, which are really coming into their own now. As the French cavalry the horses are basically being eaten by the French, starving to death and then being eaten. That is really, as far as I understand it, the real core of what you might call the partisan war. It's regular military units who are fighting in irregular circumstances, but with peasant support. And the further Napoleon gets into Russia, the more unsympathetic, the more ruthless the peasants become. When he's in Lithuania, Belarusia, it's equivocal. What turns them against Napoleon there, I think you've got different regional contexts, is the French foraging, the brutality of French requisitioning. Once you get into central Russia, then I think there's a nationalist element there.
So we're seeing like the seeds of Russian nationalism.
This is also, if you like, a change over time, even between, let's say, 1808 and 1812. I mean, and it's something that Michael Broers knows a great deal more about than I do, but a point where what may be spontaneous resistance, for example, to the French army requisitioning food, leaving peasants starving, acquires both a nationalist element and a degree of state coordination and control. And to the extent that you will get military writers who are saying the way to deal with Napoleon, because we can't deal with him on the battlefield, is precisely by these sort of methods. The state needs to recognize that it becomes the engine of guerrilla warfare, that it needs to use these tactics, and it needs, therefore, to forge a relationship between the state and the people through the army in order to do that.
And I suppose there were many kind of Russian nobles, many in the kind of Russian upper classes who were quite confused by this new style of warfare, or might have been reluctant to engage upon it. Could you?
Of course, it's radical in its implications.
Yes.
It's about mobilizing the people.
Yes, I think Alexander himself has far fewer qualms about this than the Russian nobility, because of course serf rebellions are endemic in Russia. Alexander has much less fear as the Tsar about mobilizing people, because you get something not, I won't say similar, but not dissimilar in Spain, where the Cortes and Cadiz are declaring a people's war, declaring total war, as it were, legitimizing guerrilla commanders, and you actually get Spanish provincial military governors much more reticent about this because they can sense disorder on a wider scale that will in fact turn the propertied classes towards the French. They may be worried about a similar pattern in Russia. It doesn't happen. It is a very, very interesting phenomenon that Alexander seems, I think, to be able to control quite well.
I would just like you both to assess the significance of the 1812 campaign in the context of Napoleon's downfall. I mean, is it the case that essentially inevitably there's no way back after the defeat he suffered during the 1812 campaign? Professor Hugh Strawn.
Well, inevitably is an adverb that most historians probably resist using, because it's inevitable from the perspective of 1814 or 1815. It doesn't look inevitable even in the winter of 1812, 1813, because Napoleon's powers of recovery in 1813-14 are extraordinary. What I think is crucial is, and Alexander has a big role to play in this too, is holding the alliance together, and particularly holding the Russians in that alliance at the point where the danger to Russia has been removed. So by 1813-14, this war is moving away from Russia to the point that, why don't the Russians just pack up and go home? That's what you would logically expect. And the ability to keep them engaged, and of course, crucially, to get Austria into this war as well, means that the coalition holds together. So, of course, that coalition couldn't have been forged and held together had it not been for the Russian campaign. And of course, Napoleon has exhausted the Grande Armée and is going to struggle to rebuild it. But he, broadly speaking, does manage to rebuild it. And so there's still a lot left to do at the beginning of 1813.
Dr. Broers, do you agree with that?
Oh, yes, I do, pretty much. In fact, if you look at 1814 in France, Russia is the only military force capable of defeating Napoleon, because Napoleon has got the Allies in perpetual check, even fighting in France 2 years later, even after the colossal losses of Russia. The Austrians are a paper army. The Prussians are a very good army, but they're very small and they're carrying the brunt of the fighting. The Russians are very much holding themselves in reserve. They could deliver the killer blow at any time. Napoleon's got the Allies in perpetual check. What brings Napoleon down in the end is that the French government deposes him because they feel that he should have sued for peace on the good terms he was offered in 1813 and 1814. I think it's very important to remember the diplomatic angle here. The Austrians are fed up fighting. As Hughes pointed out, the Russians are pretty fed up fighting. Alexander's sitting there thinking, I'm 3,000 miles from home. What's going on behind my back? And Napoleon is my friend, basically. It takes an internal move from the French to depose Napoleon.
This programme was to mark the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Borodino. Taking part was Voice of Russia's Joseph Richardson, Professor Michael Broers, tutor in modern European history at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and Hugh Strawn, Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford. To discuss these issues, Voice of Russia's Joseph Richardson is joined by Professor Michael Broers, tutor in modern European history at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, and Hugh Strawn, Professor of the History of War at All Souls College, Oxford.
Why does Napoleon feel that he has to amass this vast army in order to invade Russia? Professor Hugh Strawn.
Well, the issue for Napoleon in the political sense, rather more perhaps in the economic sense, is what he would describe as the continental system, the desire to control the economy within Europe, the landmass of Europe, and hope that by doing so he could debilitate Britain, which his apologists want to imagine he was going to create. And the answer is I don't think he ever was going to do that.
Dr. Broers, do you agree with this? Is Napoleon essentially fixated on war to the extent that he can't conceive of pursuing any other option in his dealings with Russia?
Well, I agree very much with Professor Strawn about the, as it were, the political and economic motivation for the war. I've never really been convinced by the argument that Napoleon is insatiably driven by conquest. I mean, this is planned as a very rapid campaign. Very rapid, a matter of weeks, to go in and teach Alexander a lesson, to bring him back into the blockade. If you read through it,
was dependent really on wider patterns of trade. Russia was breaking that blockade, was breaking the economic stranglehold which Napoleon hoped to put around Britain. There are many other motives, but in terms of the sort of wider geopolitical context of the Napoleonic Wars and the long-term clash between France and Britain, that's the context within which this campaign is set. I mean, in addition to that, of course, you have to think about Napoleon's own desire for continuous conquest. Here is a man who really feeds on war and whose right to remain in power depends on war, and there is no logical limit. Once he stops, what's he going to do? Is he really going to establish the sort of solid Napoleonic empire which
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. On the 7th of September 1812, the invading forces of Napoleon Bonaparte fought Russia's armies at the obscure village of Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. The biggest battle of the campaign was to prove fateful for Napoleon's military schemes. A few months later, the remains of the bedraggled Grande Armée began their long, disorderly retreat, harried by Cossacks and the bitter Russian winter. But what caused Napoleon to invade in the first place? And why did the campaign of 1812 prove such a disaster?
a lot of the military correspondence, he's very concerned about having to fight on two fronts, about having to pull good troops out of Spain, where in 1811 he's winning. He knows he's gambling in that respect. He has an option. He is being urged, particularly by his supporters in the Duchy of Warsaw, the Poles, to start annexing parts of Belarusia, to start annexing parts of Lithuania. As far as I know, there are no plans to do that at all. This is a rapid campaign to teach Alexander a lesson. They'd made a deal in 1807 at Tilsit about spheres of influence, and I think Napoleon wants to return to that. I really don't think in this respect he's driven by conquest. I do think he wants to put his